What is up, guys? Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to be talking about styling colors. After watching this lesson, you'll be able to style any color you want with CSS. We're going to start with the most basic way of adding color to an element, and that is simply using the CSS name of that color. So over on the right-hand side, we have a h3 tag with style my colors text, and that's surrounded by a div which has a 1 pixel border. So let's start by styling the color of the h3 tag. We'll give it the color property, and you can see there are a list of different CSS colors which we can use. So let's try the color sea green. Let's refresh our page, and we can see our h3 color has been adjusted. This is a very straightforward way of assigning colors. You'll see with some of the other methods, we need to remember a line or string of digits, for example, using hex codes or using RGB values, which we'll get to next. Now, the downside to this method is that there are a finite number of colors which have a predefined CSS name. So although there are a large number of them, if we want very fine-tuned configurability of our colors here, we might need to make use of a different method. The next method we'll consider is the RGB method. Now, the best way is to see this visualized. So we're going to make use of the W3 site because here we have an RGB calculator. So what does RGB stand for? It stands for red, blue, and green. And we can provide this CSS function with 3 values, each of them a number between 0 and 255, and they indicate the strength of the red, green, or blue values when constructing a color. So in this example, we have 3 sliders which represent the 3 colors. And we can see at the moment this is set to red 255, green 0, and blue 0. So hopefully it's not a surprise that we have a solid red color. If we were to turn down the red color and boost the green color to 255, then we have a solid green color. Now we can of course mix the colors as well. So let's add some red, some green, see what we get to. We get a yellow color there. We can add some blue as well. And you can see depending on the values we provide, if we add more red, we get more of a reddish tint. If we add more blue, we get more of a bluish tint. There's a wide range of colors that we can configure this way. So what we'd ordinarily do, because we can't usually in our head translate an RGB value into a color, at least not very accurately, is we would make use of an RGB calculator. We'd have an idea of what color we're looking for. For example, let's see if we can create an orange. So this was my best attempt at creating an orange. It's mostly red with some green, but not really any blue. So we have our RGB value there at the top. It's 218.90. 0. So returning to our CSS, instead of a CSS color, we can provide the function RGB, and we're going to input the values 218.90, 0. Let's refresh our page, and we get the orange color, the same orange color we found in the RGB finder. Now, it's also possible to provide a 4th value. In fact, we can do this with pretty much any color. There's a way of styling its opacity or its alpha channel. And in the case of RGB, it's going to be a number between 0 and 1, so a decimal number. And if we were to specify 0.5, it means that this color is going to be 50% transparency. Now, returning back to our calculator, we can see that below the RGB value, there are 2 additional values. Firstly, there's this value which is prefixed by a hashtag. This is referred to as a hex value. It's another way of representing the RGB data. So the first 2 digits represent red, the middle 2 digits represent green, and the final 2 digits represent blue. We then have HSL, which is an additional way of defining colors, and it stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. Now, for a very quick crash course on what hex code is, it's another way of writing binary in a more condensed form. Binary is, of course, a sequence of zeros and ones, and each reference to a 0 or a 1 is referred to as a single bit. Now, hex, which is a base 16 way of recording numbers, each of these digits can record a value between 0 and 15, and they're the equivalent of 4 bits in binary. Now, if we put 2 of them together, we have 8 bits, and that can represent a value between 0 and 255. So the reason why hex is used is it's easier to use 2 digits than it is to use a sequence of 8 zeros or ones. So it's a condensed version of binary. So these first 2 values represent a binary version of a number between 0 and 255. Well, that's exactly what we want when we're using RGB. The next two, again, represent a number between 0 and 255. So this is exactly the same as RGB. We're providing 3 color values. We're just doing so in hexadecimal format. So let's create another color. And what we'll do is we'll create a background color, because it's also very useful to understand how to set the background of elements. So we'll go for something a bit darker. We don't want it to be too garish. So this is a fairly dark blue. And instead of using the RGB value, we're going to pull this hex value. Let's just copy that to the clipboard. Firstly, let's remove the alpha channel from the original RGB value. We're then going to style the div. So the div is everything that surrounds the H3 tag. It's anything inside that box. So we'll provide a color property. This time we're going to specify a hex value. Now we don't need to type hex or anything like that. We can simply paste our hex value in there, and automatically the browser is going to recognize that as a color. But instead of color, we're going to pass background color. So this is a very useful property for styling color. So we can style the color of the font with color, and we can style the background color of the element with background color property. So let's take a look at that. So we now have a fairly vivid orange on a dark blue or dark purple background. Now, one useful trick to be aware of when working with RGB or hex values is that when all of the 3 color digits are the same, that's when we create black, gray, and white styles. For example, if we were to change this H3 so that all of the values were 218, we'll get a fairly light gray. If we were instead to use something like 120 for all, then we get something which is a little bit darker as a gray color. And it's really the same with hex. If these 3 sets of 2 digits were all equivalent, then we're going to get something that's either black, white, or gray. So for example, let's set our hex code to 3 sets of 2 zeros. And you can see we get a dark black in this case. Now returning back to our W3 docs, we see an example of the HSL method of defining colors. Now HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness, and we can provide those 3 values to the HSL function. Now once again, we have 3 sliders and they help us to understand what these values refer to. So let's start with hue. Now hue is basically just a fancy word for color, and what we see here is a color wheel with values between 0 and 360. And we can see that every shade is represented on this wheel. So as we can see, it's in some ways more straightforward because we have a specific hue associated with a specific number. With the previous RGB method, we actually need 3 numbers to associate with a specific color. It's a lot easier to remember 1 value for your hue than remembering 3 values for RGB. So what are these saturation and lightness values? Once again, the bars give us a clue here. So saturation refers to the intensity of the color. So the lower the intensity value, the more gray we see mixed in. And if we have a saturation of 0, well, the color is not saturating at all. We just have a pure gray. So if we want the maximum intensity version of the color, we set it to 100%. Lightness refers to the amount of white light mixed in. And we get to the point where if we have 100% white light, well, it's actually not red anymore. It's now a white color. If we have 76 light, you can see it's a fairly light, almost washed out looking color. Whereas if we have a value below 50, we can see that the blackness is starting to take over because there's no white color being mixed in anymore. Finally, if we have a lightness of 0, we once again get a pure black color. It doesn't matter what the hue is. If the lightness is 0, we're always going to get a black color. So let's choose a color. We're going to go for a fairly vivid magenta. We'll set the lightness to 50, so there's a nice equal balance, and we'll set the saturation to 100, so there's maximum intensity on this color. So we can see our HSL value there at the top. Notice, by the way, that the value for the hue is an integer, while the second 2 values for saturation and lightness are percentages. So let's copy this HSL function, and we'll now use that HSL to set the color of our H3 tag. Now we might wonder why there are so many different ways of styling colors in CSS. And the idea is that each of them is designed to be an improvement on the previous in terms of inherent understanding to a regular human being. So if we take something like hex, it really doesn't make a lot of sense unless you know how hex works. RGB is a bit more understandable to a regular human, but it's difficult to understand which combinations of red, green, and blue produce which lightings unless you're already a lighting technician. HSL improves on this with hue, saturation, and lightness. It's a little bit easier for the average human to understand what kind of color they're going to get as a result of the HSL value. Now, it's still not perfect, and that's why there's a further way of defining colors referred to as HWB, which is hue, whiteness, and blackness. So this is meant to make the most sense to a human intuitively, which is we pick a color or a hue, then we can simply control the amount of lightness or the amount of darkness we add to the color. So for example, let's grab this HWB function. We have 168 with the hue, and we have 11% whiteness and 11% blackness. So we can just copy that into our CSS. So let's replace our HSL function with HWB. Let's refresh our page. Now we can see it's not working. So it's to do with something that's a little bit counterintuitive with the way that that color picker works. And that's, we don't want commas in our HWB function here. So let's just remove those. And now we can see the colors working. So if we head back to our previous HSL function, we can see it did actually have commas. So it worked with commas, whereas HWB doesn't. And if we just try removing the commas from the HSL function, we can see that it does actually still work in this case. So HSL works with or without commas, but HWB, it's very important that there are no commas. Otherwise, as you can see, it's not going to work. Now, what is the most important takeaway here? We've seen many different ways of defining colors. Which color method should we actually use? And the answer is it doesn't really matter too much. Personally, I'm either using the CSS named colors just because it's more straightforward. So I'll use something like aqua or sea green because it's predefined. Or if I want a more specific color value, I use hex. Why do I use hex? Just because hex is what I first started using when defining colors, and I've carried on using hex to this day. However, if I see another developer has used HSL or RGB or HWB, I know how it works and I can understand their code. If you think about it, by the time we've picked a color, probably using a color editor, so we've selected a hue, we've selected our amount of transparency or alpha channel. From that point onwards, it really doesn't matter too much whether we represent that as hex or RGB or HSL. And these other color values can include an alpha channel as well. So for example, one thing you might not have realized is that even hex can make use of an alpha channel. So for example, if we add a fourth byte here to the end of our hex code, let's have a look at our background color, you can see it becomes transparent. So ultimately, it really doesn't matter too much. Just pick your favorite, stick with that, but have a working understanding of the existence of the others and how they work. That way we'll be easily able to communicate with other developers if they prefer one of the other methods. All right, thanks very much for watching. Catch you in the next part of the course.